So we have these mechanisms built in to share water. We measure water in units of time, you know, days or hours. And that we use as much water as there is. The state, on the other hand, is measuring units of volume, acre feet. So this is problematic, and I'm going to try and wrap up the presentation. You can ask me any types of questions you want on this subject. But, you know, I'm in the Taos Valley Acequia Association, and we have a really great water settlement with the tribes and the mutual domestics in the town. And, you know, it's been settled for 18 years. They've been negotiating, but, you know, as an ecologist and being trained by a hydrologist, I don't like it. You know, the lawyer and I don't see eye to eye, even though I appreciate him and what he's done for the acequias, and, you know, and we need that water settlement, but the long-term vision isn't there. And so, you know, I'm wondering what's going to happen in the future with the water shortage. And again, I'm relying on my crops to be able to withstand droughts, just like the Hopi are relying on their crops to withstand, you know, their background conditions. And then, of course, I'm depending on the community network for all of us to band together. But there's different values. And it's a very complex situation. First of all, you know, the big values are we measure water in units of time, and the state measures it in units of volume. So that's a huge difference in perspective. But then within our community, you know, this region has undergone various stages of water administration, from Native American, which was like reverence and sacredness of water, to acequias, which was more or less the same thing, but now we're starting to divert water and have more intensive agriculture in smaller areas. And then we got into the Mexican era, which is pretty much the same thing as the New Spain era. And then we got to the United States and the Territorial Water Code, which separates water rights from the land, and it's two different types of property and all these things. So, you know, everybody has a different belief and a different foundation of how they view water. You know, and I really like how the old timers think about it. They say, well, however much water in your ditch, that's how much water you get. I don't care how much water rights you think you have. And I'm like, I'm with that guy, you know, because that's how it is. I'm trying to figure out how to squeeze more water out of the system, but it doesn't work. So, you know, the community aspect of it is something that, you know, requires more consideration. How are we going to pull all of us together, get us on the same page about, you know, how we're going to deal with the scarcity? And I'm not offering an answer to that. I'm just posing it as another question for us to consider. So that's the community. And then you get into climate change. And so here we are trying to address all these issues at once in the revitalization of agriculture. It's pretty challenging, you know, and here we are on July 19th. Look at our corn. That's in another field. We are working 4 fields. So I'm going to give a little bit of a perspective from all 4 of these fields. This is our highest elevation field in the village of Chamizal. You know, have you ever heard the saying, knee high by the 4th of July? That's how you know your corn's doing good. Look at that. That's July 19th. No water. Okay, do you think this corn produced? Do you think it produced corn? Or do you think it withered and died under the drought? How many think it produced? How many think it withered and died? It produced. And it looked good. The corn was short, and we had corn, but guess what? All the suffering of the drought. Well, before I get to that, you know, I'm looking at all this drought situation, you know, and the scarcity of water. Of course, that's all we have in the acequias. But if we look at our region, this is the variability that is the background of where we're at. So, you know, climate change is presented as a new thing, but here in the Southwest, that's the norm. You know, there's nothing predictable about this pattern. So, you know, this is the place for us to figure out how to adapt to climate change. And like I said, I was always into the crops and knowing the crops would do it, especially reflecting on like presenters like Lillian Hill and where she comes from up here earlier today. This is her neighbor in Hopi land, David Pecoisa, and this is his field. You know, and this would shock anybody from the Midwest who grew up farming, you know, deep soils that were made by herds of bison over millions of years. This is sand. And it doesn't look like a field, but indeed it's a field, and they're pulling a lot of corn out of this without irrigation. So this should recalibrate your notion about water security and how it relates to food security, because most of us in here do not appreciate the resilience and the strength of the mother corn. And this is how it's done in the pueblos. This is a 5,000 acre site in between the Rio Grande and the Rio Chama. of dryland agricultural systems withstand these environments agriculturally, you know, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. What's the difference between them and us now is, of course, that they farmed a lot more than us, but they also had 6 years of food in storage. You know, I would argue we don't have 6 days of food in storage. So that's something to consider. When you live in a place for a long time, that place will tell you, you know what, there is such a thing as hard times, and you better be ready for them. And that's something we don't take into account nowadays. So I'm trying to look at all these and look at these dryland agricultural systems and reflecting on things I've learned, you know, talking to a lot of the elders about how they used to farm. And this looks like a turtle, and it is. But it's a piece of art, and it is. But it's actually a humidity condenser. The inside of that rock is cold, that rock pile is cold and attracts water that condenses on the inside and keeps this soil environment moist. And here you can see how it used to look before I got all fancy with it with the youth. And you can't have them hoeing weeds all the time. And but you could see I got some corn out of this. I've done this for 4 years. This was the only year it failed. And other years I was able to get corn just out of a rock pile. And you could see verdolagas here, the purslane is doing good in this rock pile. So there's something to be said about the use of rocks as a thermal mass, as something that attracts humidity. And we're not pushing that envelope far enough. So that's what we're trying to do at Sol Feliz. We had a couple workshops out there, and we're getting even more fancy on the rocks. There's no shortage of rock on my land. Everybody comes out and they say, hey, where did you get all that rock? I say, you see that field right there? Every time I plow, I pull these rocks out. And they can't believe it. That's a small pile. You should see how it looks now. And so, you know, these rock piles, we're doing some tests on them. You know, the sand mulch, Lillian mentioned this earlier, that the sand serves as a mulch. So we got some sand mulch out here, some cobble mulch, and some bare ground that we're planting corn, beans, and squash. And actually, I'm going to be planting this in a few weeks now. And now I'm getting into the idea of winter planting and then letting the spring temperatures tell me when these things are ready. And then, because every year I'm sloppy in the harvest and some beans fall by the wayside. And then I say, how come there's beans over here in this patch? I didn't plant any beans here. And lo and behold, it's from the last year or the year before. So somehow these seeds overwinter. So I think that's something for us to consider. I mean, we're familiar with planting garlic and hard red wheat in the fall, but I'm thinking it's worth a trial of getting other crops in the ground in the winter, because now we're seeing the springs and the summers being more variable on the land. It's getting harder to work the land in those times. It's windy, you can't run your sprinklers. There's all kinds of reports coming in from farmers about how difficult the spring is. And for me, you know, I don't like running my tillers or breaking earth when it's windy, and it seems like wind is the norm in the spring now. So now I'm trying to get all my work done at this time of the year and see if that's going to pay off in the spring and actually indicate to me when we need to be planting in the spring, so we can start to work with the shorter and more unpredictable growing seasons. So you would be surprised that since I ran out of water in the 3rd week in June and got less than an inch of rain in 4 wimpy rainstorms after that this was my yield of corn. This is the white corn that survived the drought of 2002 and 2003 when we ran out of water in June as well. But the difference in those years is we had rain. This year we didn't have any rain, but I still got this yield. So my only mistake was I didn't plant, you know, twice as much land or 10 times as much land, and I could have, you know, afforded myself a lot more yield. And so these types of dryland agricultural techniques are characteristic of this region in terms of the pueblos and indigenous cultures, but also the acequias. Here's some melgas and, not melgas, but eras, you know, different ways of laying out your land to trap water. Here's the corn that I grew in 2003, suffering drought. See, there's a misnomer about acequias. Now a lot of people think water rights when you say acequias. But the acequias and the water they're in, I think, is more to get your crops started, because you couldn't count on the water in times past. We've been spoiled in the last 50 years from what I understand, so most of us do not have a perspective of what it is to really work with the environment, because most of our water is coming from the ground, not from the mountains. But we have that perspective here. So we laid out some research, and I tried to get the kids involved in my research. You know, I was trying to compare land-raised crops to imported crops and seeing what the yields were, and I was embracing the drought because I wanted to watch the drought kill both of my crops, but I wanted to see my crops survive more and be able to, you know, show that statistically. So I got the youth involved, and and they were all looking forward to measuring and weighing everything and getting it all laid out, and everything was going good until about the 3rd week in June, where I started to notice that my crops were having trouble. And it was because and I'm the ecologist in the room, right? I should have been able to predict this, but my field was looking really good for agriculture implementation and education, but I didn't snap that the fields next door were prairie dog villages. And even though I didn't snap to that, what really made me snap this year, and I'm gonna give you a few examples, is once the drought hit, the crops can survive. And this is something any Hopi farmer will tell you. My friend David, he goes and camps out in his field and protects his corn against coyotes. And me having that information, I should have snapped, but I didn't. And the prairie dogs started migrating in and eating our crops. And little by little, you can't keep up with these guys. In our field in Chamisal, the magpies, we built a scarecrow. They camped out on our scarecrow. They didn't care. They raised their children on the scarecrow. And I've never seen the corn get stripped down like in the cartoons. And you go out one day and there's all kinds of corn and you're like, it survived the drought, and the next day it's just like this naked cob with all kinds of string, that used to be leaves. So another one of our fields completely eaten by elk. Talked to Daniel Carmona up north, rabbits. So it was a true realization that revitalizing agriculture is a bigger deal than us just finding more farmers and growing out more crops. We have some challenges that the other animals are going to be competing for us for what is ours, or what we think is ours. And in the norte we have a saying, para mí, para vos y para los animalitos de Dios. We're planting for them too. But, not when they're going to take it all. I need some of that too, right? So... we got a weather station now. This is another interest of mine. It seemed like we were planting our field in early spring and nothing would come out. So then I put more water and nothing would come out. I put more water and I was like, I don't know what happened. Nothing's came out. And then all of a sudden one day everything came out. And then I, looked into it deeper, and it was when the nighttime high and the nighttime low and the daytime high got less than 40 degrees. We had a spell there where the daytime high was 40 degrees higher than the nighttime low, and nothing happened. And as soon as that stopped, as soon as we went to 30 degrees difference, then all the crops we planted came out. So this is the kind of challenge that we have, that the climate change is going to be throwing at us, is germination condition. And how are we going to see a condition in the future where the crops won't germinate because the weather's too wacky? And that's already what's happening. And so we're going to have to, I'm trying to look into this more. I got a weather station. I'm looking at the highs and the lows.